July 22nd, 1954. Gray, Maine. In the quaint and otherwise ordinary town of Gray, Maine is a mostly rural town, nestled between two of the larger metro areas of the state, in Portland and Auburn-Lewiston. Nestled between numerous lakes, rivers, and streams, it acts like a little getaway from the bustling cities on either end. However, this quaint area would have to deal with a 70-year-old mystery and grapple with the idea of murder that remains unsolved to this day. What happened that fateful day when 12-year-old Daniel Wood Jr. would leave his home in Gray, Maine, to be found murdered? What were the series of events leading up to his vanishing? And what do we know about the murder? And what clues do we have to try and solve this rural hometown heartbreak of a young boy robbed of his youth? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, the murder of Daniel Wood Jr. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and today on the show, we are back into the realm of true crime. And again, not with the episode you were expecting. I said last week that I was going to do the Springfield 3, and I was a big fat liar. Of course, it is still on my to-do list, and I am still doing some research on it. However, given that I had not done a New England-based story in quite some time, I felt like I was very much due for one, that is, and in my exploration of the internet, I found this case, which is very sad, of course, given the circumstances, but also strange because we know virtually nothing about the events that unfolded leading up to the death of Daniel Wood Jr. Sure, we have little bits and pieces, but we have so many questions and a couple of worthy suspects that have been proposed, but because of the time period of when this happened and the lack of DNA evidence during this time period, it has made leads or tips on this case especially hard to come by, even more than all that is where this crime took place. You know, I have been to Gray, Maine, and a portion of my family is from Maine, and I can only imagine the type of impact this had on, a small, rural, local community such as this one, and just the amount of heartbreak. And for the fact of the matter is that it has been over 70 years, and we know really nothing else about what happened that day, or even in the case in general. And it is just a very tough pill to swallow. Now, before we get into the episode, I just want to send out a disclaimer out there for you. I am a little bit congested. I do apologize if I sound a little phlegmy, and I think that's the right word, phlegmy. If I sound like that, if I come through like that, I do apologize. It's kind of like every couple months or so, I get this weird congestion thing and kind of allergies or so on and so forth, whatever it may be. I just want to throw that disclaimer out for you guys and just apologize. But with all that being said, how today's episode is going to work is that I am first going to describe where exactly Gray, Maine is, a little bit of its history and statistics for crimes such as this one, the case and disappearance and subsequent investigation following the discovery of Danny's body, the possible suspects we have, and then wrap it all up at the very end with my own personal thoughts on the entire case. Now, let's set the scene for our story here. Gray, Maine is a rural Maine town situated pretty much smack dab in the middle between two major metro areas in Portland, Maine, and then the towns of Lewiston and Auburn to the north. Gray is conveniently located at the intersections of Route 4, Route 26, Route 100, Route 115, and Route 202, and even the Maine Turnpike. Because of this, it is an ideal point for a lot of travelers exploring the natural beauty of Maine to stop for a quick minute. After all, with its location between all of these roadways, it is no surprise that the town motto is, "At the heart of it all." Now, Gray, Maine had a population of 8,269 during the 2020 census, and contains numerous lakes, including Little Sebago Lake, Crystal Lake, no, not from Friday the 13th, even though, considering the topic for today, it is kind of coincidental that they do have a Crystal Lake, and we're talking about murder today, but also Forest Lake as well. Now, Gray, Maine is also the headquarters of the Maine Fish and Wildlife Department and contains a rescued animal sanctuary, numerous farms, and a variety of water recreation activities. So yeah, it is a relatively middle-class area, and just a little brief history knowledge nugget for you. It was first established all the way back in 1736, when the land was given to a group of men from Boston, from the Boston General Court. The following year, in 1737, the roads and plans were laid out for the township of Gray. However, it wouldn't be called that until much later, the New Boston Plantation, as it was once called, ran into a litany of problems during the 1730s and into the 1740s because of the French and Indian War, and in 1745, it was attacked by Native Americans, and many farms were sacked and the cattle and livestock were killed off. Now, this caused many settlers to leave to other areas around Gray, and Fort Gray would go on to be built in the town in 1755, and subsequently the town would be changed from being called the New Boston Plantation to Gray, after a proprietor named Thomas Gray. Gray slowly became a very busy town, operating numerous sawmills, quarries, and even a carriage maker. Now the town would also be the first in the United States to have a water-powered wool mill, which is kind of neat, and the town would actually go on to play a small role for the Revolution, as the British Empire wanted to regulate the production of this wool being made from the water-powered mill, as the machinery to make the mill was inspired by the British. In an effort to tell the British to go fuck themselves, for lack of a better word, Samuel Mayall, the owner of the mill, was able to smuggle the plans for the mill and other British-inspired tech to trade with the Native Americans in hay bales. So, kind of a little interesting knowledge nugget about early American history. I find that a little bit fascinating. As somebody who does a lot of research into history and things like that, I at least found that very interesting, and I did not know. Now, the British did try assassinating Samuel Mayall twice through poisoned and a booby-trapped package, and they had zero luck in doing so, because, again, the British suck. Although, I know that last bit wasn't important to the story I'm telling today, but again, I thought it was pretty fascinating. Now, I couldn't find much about the overall general history of the town during the 1950s, when our story takes place, but I have to imagine that it was still a very industry-driven town, and very much a medium-class, average rural American town during the 1950s. Now, Maine as a state is one of the safest in the entire country, if not the safest. Now, according to the Maine Morning Star newspaper, when looking at 2022 crime statistics, it rates Maine as the safest state in the entire country, with 103 violent incidents per every 100,000 people. In comparison, the national average is 380 per every 100,000. Homicides in Maine also remain extremely uncommon, with 29 being reported yearly for the entire state in 2022, and only 18 being reported in 2021. Overall, Maine is a very safe state, and this is for a variety of reasons. The ruralness of the state leads there to be less population-dense areas, meaning less crime, and maybe people within the state own a whole lot of firearms, and they are very vocal about their ownership of firearms, so maybe that's a little bit of a contributor as well. Now, Portland is the most populated city in the state, with Lewiston being behind it, and even though in current times they have issues with petty crime, drug problems, and homelessness, murders still remain very uncommon within the general state of Maine. Now, of course, those stats would be even fewer in 1950, when towns were even less populated and more spread out than they even are now. These types of things don't happen very often, especially when it comes to a crime against a child, in the case of Daniel Wood Jr. But with all that being said, let's move into the story of Daniel Wood Jr. and his disappearance and murder. Come the 1950s, things in Gray, Maine were actually very good. Gray, Maine had a surge of employment opportunities with its position in between Portland and Lewiston, and since it was rural and not in the city, many people enjoyed the scenery, and it provided a lot of people with, kind of the desire to live there and be away from the city and things like that, and there were jobs. In 1954, 12-year-old Daniel Wood Jr. lived in Gray with his mother, his father, and 3 other siblings. Known as Danny, he enjoyed playing sports such as basketball and baseball, and went fishing very often. Given you are an area of the country with numerous plentiful fishing spots, I would too. Danny was tall for his age and weighed just around 100 pounds. He had glasses, and like many other kids, he enjoyed the summertime away from school and hanging out with his friends. However, he actually couldn't wait for August to roll around. Danny was told by his father that he could get a job at the end of August picking beans at a nearby farm. Unlike other kids his age, Danny wanted to get a job. He liked the idea of making money for himself. However, since he was only 12 years old, that limited his options on where he could work for his age. Because of his passion for trying to work for himself, this ultimately would be the catalyst for this entire case. On July 22nd, 1954, Daniel would receive a phone call at his home on Portland Road from a friend of his that lived just a mile down the street about going fishing that day. Shortly after receiving this phone call, Danny would grab his fishing pole and make way out the door. Mrs. Wood was busy tending to Danny's siblings at the time and didn't pay 2 seconds of attention to the slam of a car door that Danny seemed to enter. This was a rarity, and with Danny's friend living just a mile down the road, this was odd. Why was Danny getting into a car? However, Mrs. Wood at this time didn't think twice about this. She was too busy with the other kids. She, again, didn't even really pay 2 cents to it. Now, from what I could find in doing my research, was that whether or not the friend of Danny's had a car, or perhaps his parents picked Danny up in one, that remains unclear, and I couldn't really find that. And the friend that Danny went to go meet up fishing with was not named in any of the sources that I found and used for this episode. So that itself is a mystery. However, just a few short minutes later, Mrs. Wood would get a phone call from Danny. Danny was calling using a phone at a corner store at Gray Center. Now, when I say Gray Center, I kind of mean like downtown, but Gray Center is actually an intersection of where four roads kind of come together. And throughout all my sources, this is what it's referred to. Just for a little bit of context, that is. Now, this corner store was approximately 3.5 miles away from the Wood family home, which of course was impossible for Danny to make it to if he was there on foot, because after all, only a few minutes had passed at this point. Which means that whoever picked him up in this car must have brought him there. And this is when Danny's mother starts to kind of connect the pieces of, I heard a car door slam. Somebody must have picked him up, and somebody must have brought him to that corner store. She just didn't know who. Now, on the phone, Danny goes on to tell his mother that he had been offered a job by a traveling salesman for 50 cents an hour, who went door to door to try and sell magazines. Now, on the surface, this seemed like a very enterprising opportunity for a young boy trying to make some cash for himself, but of course, nowadays, if someone came up to you and offered you the same story, you probably wouldn't go. That's, of course, the stark change in societal norms. Danny would go on to say that the traveling salesman would be taking him into Lewiston and told his mother that he would be back by dark. However, that wouldn't come. It wasn't long after he didn't return home that night that the Wood family reported Danny missing to the local police. An investigation was quickly launched as they tried to track down this lead on the traveling salesman and where Danny would have gone. One of the first people to speak to the Wood family following the announcement that Danny was missing was the owner of the general store in which Danny used the phone at. Edra Wilkinson said that he did come in to use the phone and that he was alone and not with anyone else. After finishing his phone call, he left the store and ran up the street. Now, he did not get into a car from what Wilkinson could see from the store, but of course we have to imagine that he was probably still with this car that picked him up at the Wood household. Now, as days passed on and we reached the 27th of July, no sign of Danny would be found, and word about the disappearance started to spread around New England, with even some people claiming to have sighted the young boy. These started to seem like credible leads, with one coming all the way from Worcester, Massachusetts, claiming someone had seen the boy down there, but unfortunately it was a case of mistaken identity and quickly ruled out. A man who authorities thought could have had a connection to the case was picked up in Portland, and that didn't really go anywhere as he was released shortly later. A sighting would also come in from all the way down in Connecticut of someone claiming to have seen Danny as a magazine salesman. Now, of course, this would kind of fit, but when asked where the boy was from, he stated New York. The Connecticut witness thought that it was very strange that this boy salesman did not possess a New York accent. Of course, this also turned out to be another case of mistaken identity. This same day, we have witnesses from Lewiston claiming to have seen a boy matching Danny's description, traveling as a door-to-door salesman trying to sell needles. Now, this also kind of fits because Danny did say that who he got a job from was of course a traveling salesman, but he also stated in the phone call that this traveling salesman was selling magazines, not needles. And also with Lewiston's close vicinity to Gray, of course, that we've already established, this kind of makes this more believable. Witnesses said the boy selling needles looked extremely young, but that he acted older for his age. Eventually, however, this lead was ruled out, and it just so happens that this was a different boy entirely. The most compelling possible sighting of Danny that we do have is from a classmate of his named Donna Aberley. Donna claimed to have seen Danny that very same afternoon that he went missing. If true, this would give us a very good look at what he was possibly doing in his last moments before he disappeared. Now, Donna stated that he was seen in a car near the Dry Mills School and that he wasn't alone. Daniel had actually noticed Donna first from the car and called out to her to say hello. With him in the car was a dark-complexioned man who had white hair, a woman, and 2 other children, all of which she did not recognize. That is, Donna, that is. The man had stopped this maroon-colored sedan and was looking at a map in his hands in the driver's seat. After this short little interaction between Donna and Danny, the man folded up the map and headed towards Poland Spring Road to Little Sebago Lake, and the car drove away. Donna then said, in kind of recounting this incident, that the car's license plates were yellow, which was noteworthy because Maine, during this time period, did not have yellow license plates. Now, of course, keep this in mind, as this kind of all will circle back kind of at the end with the yellow license plate. I do have more information to share about that. And kind of come back to the idea of the roads and everything like that and the direction the car went, because I did do a little Google map smithing on between Poland Spring Road and the direction it was going. Now, if you kind of look at these locations on a map, obviously I looked at the Dry Mills Schoolhouse location, which is only about 10 minutes down the road from Danny's house, and then you look up Poland Spring Road towards Little Sebago Lake. It's kind of an additional kind of 15 minutes, and then it's kind of like a loop around if you want to go to Little Sebago Lake, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So I don't know if in this recounting of events that Donna Aberly maybe have gotten her, again, she's young, she's a classmate, got her roads confused or which lake. Of course, there's 3 lakes that are very close proximity from each other. And if this maroon-colored sedan drove up towards Poland Spring Road and then to go to Little Sebago Lake again, they would do this kind of overarching, almost U, practically. They would leave the Dry Mills Schoolhouse, they would go up, take Poland Spring Road, come right back down, and then go back down towards Little Sebago Lake. Although that doesn't make any sense, because Little Sebago Lake, if they just went the other way, out of the Dry Mills School and went basically through Gray Center again, you could also get to Little Sebago Lake. So that part doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And of course, I will be sharing kind of these Google Maps screenshots I took on my Instagram, so you can use that for reference as well. Now, the following day, on July 28th, more investigating was done with the Maine Fish and Game. They searched the woods behind the Wood household and found a blood-stained towel in the woods that was sent off to a pathologist in Portland for testing. They also took Mrs. Wood's dress, for some reason, for testing as well, and I couldn't find out if anything came from these tests in my research, but the taking of Mrs. Wood's dress was weird and odd and didn't make much sense, and other creators who have done episodes on this, they also feel like that's very weird, and they don't really know what implications the dress had in terms of the investigation. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. However, I digress. Other search teams from the Maine Forestry Service started searching other areas of the woods, and even the pond that Danny was supposed to go fishing at, not too far from his house, was actually drained and searched. Now, something would come out of that day, and it would be what I would consider a lead. However, the Maine police didn't think so at the time. As Mrs. Wood was at home, she received a phone call. On this phone call, it asked her if she wanted to accept a long-distance call coming from Manhattan, New York. Not knowing what this was about, she agreed, and on the end of the line was a woman. On this phone call, she would identify herself with the last name being either Goodson or Gidson. Now, Mrs. Wood couldn't fully understand what she said, because this lady had a very thick and hard-to-understand accent. Now, this lady, who identified herself as Goodson or Gidson, however, she began to tell Mrs. Wood that she knew the man who took Danny, and that he had recently traveled to Maine from Birmingham, Alabama, and that he ran a farm that acted like a boarding school for kids. Now, this woman on the phone said that this man from Birmingham, Alabama was a very mean man, and he drove a maroon Ford Studebaker sedan. That color car does match with what Donna Aberly saw near the Dry Mills School as well, but again, we will recap that and go into that a little bit later. The police, however, once looking into this, couldn't find any evidence of this man existing, and from what I could find in my research, no names were provided in the sources for me to even Google a guy as this potential suspect. However, of course, I will go back to this guy in the theories section. The police advised, since they couldn't find any evidence of this man or anything in Birmingham, Alabama, or this boarding school farm, they advised the Wood family that this was most likely a hoax played by some unknown party. Now, on July 31st, 9 days after Danny first went missing, two fishermen from Freeport, Maine, were fishing along the Little Androscoggin River in nearby Auburn and discovered the nude and badly beaten body of a young boy. Once the fishermen alerted authorities, and authorities descended on the scene, it was concluded that this was the body of Danny Wood Jr. A shoestring was found, still wrapped around his left wrist, leading authorities to conclude that he was most likely bound in some way before death. The autopsy revealed the cause of death as repeated blunt force trauma, and that even though he was found in the river, it looked like this was merely a dumping site, as he had no water in his lungs when discovered. It was theorized that by the coroner, that his body could have been in the water anywhere from 3 to 5 days, and in the subsequent days following, authorities were able to locate articles of Danny's clothing along the riverbank, such as a pair of Argyle socks, believed to be his, and his pink-rimmed glasses found discarded up into a tree. Now, the coroner also deemed that, obviously they determined cause of death being repeated blunt force trauma. The damage and the wounds consistent looked to be that of a wooden stick, was what was described as a wooden stick. That's what he was beaten with. And he was beaten repeatedly, to the point that when his body was discovered, people said that almost he was hit so hard in the head repeatedly that one of his eyes was almost dislodged from its socket. Now, of course, that is a very gruesome image, and I do apologize for that. But I am just trying to give you the whole tale and the whole experience in its entirety. Now, as the search continued, a farmer helping out with the search discovered a broken handle of what appeared to belong to a sledgehammer discarded in one of the fields near the riverbank. Now, this could be responsible for the murder of Danny. However, due to a great amount of rain that had fallen in the past few days, they could not get a good read on whether or not any blood or hair had been present on the wooden handle. Of course, DNA evidence just came out in 1953, and the idea of testing for DNA evidence was in its infancy, meaning that during this time, the handle didn't really tell them anything, which is extremely unfortunate. Now, it was never confirmed nor denied that this handle that this farmer found in one of his fields was the actual murder weapon, but it seems pretty convenient that this kind of broken sledgehammer handle was found next to the river that, of course, Danny's body was found in. Why, in the case if this was the murder weapon, why didn't the killer just throw the handle into the river? Maybe he was, if this did happen to be the murder site or a dumping site or whatever it may be, why would he just maybe not throw the sledgehammer handle into the river? Maybe he thought somebody would find the handle in the river. Who knows? Because obviously Danny's body ended up in the river, whether that be on purpose or however may have ended up there. It must have been on purpose. He must have dumped Danny's body in the river. Why didn't he throw the sledgehammer handle in there as well? To me, that would have been a very much easier way to discard of the handle rather than just leave it in a field for somebody to find. But of course, that's not confirmed that was ever the murder weapon. I am just theorizing. Now, following the discovery of Danny's body, a funeral was planned for August 2nd, but later had to be postponed as authorities requested the body once again for more testing from a leading expert in forensic pathology from Harvard. Again, it is unclear what these tests uncovered, as I couldn't fully find that, and after all of this, investigators were pretty much at a dead end at this point in terms of leads. Now, there were a couple leads that would come out, and one being involved a man named Philip Wheeler. Now, Philip Wheeler was questioned after he was found with 4 teenage boys in a traffic stop that was done by police in Westport, Maine. Now, this man, Philip Wheeler, was originally from Lynn, Massachusetts, and he told the police that he had just enjoyed having young boys ride around with him and that he had picked them up throughout Portland and South Portland. Now, to me, that is extremely odd, and of course the police were right to kind of question and say, okay, this guy likes riding around with young boys, and we know that Danny was most likely picked up in a car. Maybe he was walking, and the car just said, oh, hey, do you want to ride? So it was right for them to question this Philip Wheeler character. And again, he was questioned under suspicion, but it seems like nothing further came from this, and there was no detainment, no charges, nothing like that. And I don't believe there was any evidence to connect Philip Wheeler with the death of Danny Wood. Now, another theory came from the idea of another murder that had just happened up in Canada just a day before Danny's body was discovered. 6-year-old Raymond Trudeau would go missing on July 27th in Montreal, and his remains would be found on the 31st down at the waterfront of the city. His remains were dismembered and wrapped in newspaper and spread about in numerous cardboard boxes, discarded next to a variety of fruit and vegetable waste. In the following days, Lucien Picard, who was regarded as an alcoholic and basically the town drunk, and was kind of this really easily recognizable figure. He was very short, standing at just under 5 feet tall, and having an almost Charlie Chaplin-like mustache. If that's not easily identifiable or easily recognizable, I don't know what is. Now, Lucien Picard, it turns out that he had lured the young Trudeau off the street and kidnapped him and brought him back to his apartment where he did this gruesome act. Now, Lucien was caught and tried and convicted of the crime and stated to police that when he was caught, he couldn't remember the details of the event as he was always intoxicated. Lucien Picard was executed by hanging in 1955, and why Lucien presents himself as a worthy suspect in this case is due to the close proximity from Montreal, Quebec to Maine, and the fact that Quebec's license plates were yellow in 1954, which would be matching with the color described on the car by Donna Aberley. Now, another proposed suspect was a man named Herman Barmore, and this was a man that Police Chief Alton Savage thought was the culprit. Barmore was a killer who was currently in prison for a murder of a Boy Scout named Peter Gorham in Evanston, Illinois in 1955. Now, Peter Gorham was the same age as Danny at 12 years old, and Barmore had killed the boy to cover up a sexual crime he committed on him. Now, when proposed as a possible suspect, this was after Barmore's conviction in 1957. Chief Savage tried to get in touch with Barmore to discuss the murder of Danny, and Barmore wouldn't talk and said that anything he knew, he would eventually take to the grave with him. But with that being said, let's get into our theories and suspects section and discuss my own personal thoughts on this as well. Of course, that was pretty much it the police had for leads. They really didn't have much to go on. Of course, DNA evidence not being a factor into this case severely limited them in what they could find out. And again, there was no sightings. Next to the Donna Aberley and Edward Wilkinson, who saw him in the corner store make the phone call, that was pretty much it. There was nobody who saw anything. And that makes it very, of course, limited on suspects and who the murderer was and things like that. Now, it is important to note that in doing my research, when Danny Wood Jr. was found, obviously he was nude, and authorities quickly rushed to the assumption that a sexual-based crime had taken place, and obviously the murder was connected to a sexual-based crime that took place, and they assumed that, but then quickly retracted that statement and said that that was bold of them to accuse that had happened, that it was a sexual-based crime. But I couldn't find whether or not when they did the autopsy, if they came back and confirmed that it was just kind of like, oh, the body's nude, there must have been a sexual-based crime, and then they're like, oh, wait, that was too quick of us to assume that, we can't assume that. And then I couldn't find anywhere whether or not, like, once they did the autopsy, if that was confirmed or not. So that is kind of speculatory. If somebody has done research into this case and has some more context in this, feel free to leave it in the comments, send it to the Unblurring the Unknown email. I greatly appreciate it if you did happen to find that information that I did not. Again, I couldn't find that anywhere. So it is uncertain whether or not a sexual-based crime took place, but it is pretty much confirmed that Danny had died from blunt force trauma. And again, I will go into Herman Barmore and his killing of Peter Gorham as in the suspect section, but his MO is a little different. Again, maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself before we get into theories. But let's get into that. Let's get into theories in this whole thing. Now, our first theory is Picard. Now, on the surface, Lucien Picard poses himself as a viable suspect. Of course, with his hanging in 1955, authorities couldn't question him, and with a license plate cover of Quebec being yellow at the time, this would match. However, Picard was a raging alcoholic, and stated during his questioning to the police during the Raymond Trudeau investigation that he remembers next to nothing about the slaying of the young boy because he was so drunk. Now, my question is, would an incoherent drunk really be able to cross the border, kidnap, and possibly hold Danny for a day or two, as the autopsy confirmed that he was only in the water for 3 to 5 days, meaning that Danny was held in captivity at some point? Would Picard, in his drunk state, his consistent drunk state, be able to hold him for a couple days, kill him, and then dump him into the river, and then cross the border again without being a drunken idiot to the point of getting himself caught? I'm going to say no, and I just highly doubt it. And because of this, I doubt Picard's involvement. If Picard was a somewhat conscious human being who did not have a raging drinking problem, Picard would probably pose himself as a very viable suspect, and the license plate color fits. However, again, I am very speculative and very not convinced that it was Picard just because of his alcohol habit. I don't think he would have been able to cross the border, commit the crime, do what he did, and then cross the border again without being caught. I mean, he took the body of Raymond Trudeau, dismembered him into multiple cardboard boxes, wrapped them in newspaper, and then dumped them by basically the waterfront. And it's like, somebody's going to see that. You did that when you were drunk, and you're going to get caught. Because he was so drunk, he did that, and he got caught, and then obviously hung and executed. So, for him to be this sneaky about it, if he did do it, I'm just really, really doubtful. Now, our second theory is Barmore. Now, of course, we just talked a little bit about Barmore, but even to me, I doubt his involvement. The only similarities between Danny and Peter Gorham's kind of killings is the age. But Barmore killed Gorham with a rifle, not a blunt object. And before you say MOs could change, that is true. But Barmore, again, used a rifle, not a blunt object. And if Barmore used rifles in his killings, you would think that he would bring it with him again if he went to commit another crime, and I think he did, although I didn't spend a whole lot of time diving into Herman Barmore's entire history or Peter Gorham's kind of case in its entirety. I just wanted to focus on Danny's. I could dive into that, but that's like a whole separate thing. Now, if Herman Barmore was committing more crimes, it would make sense to me that he would use a gun throughout his killings. And I feel like I've done enough research into serial killers at this point that the MOs are usually pretty consistent. Now, Barmore's lack of talking to Alton Savage is suspicious, but Barmore would go on to die in prison in 1966, so we can't go back and question him either. To me, it doesn't fully fit, and there is no evidence to show that Barmore was even in Maine at the time of Danny's disappearance. Now, our third theory is another killer. Now, another thought process I had when doing this episode was seeing if there were any active serial killers in Maine during this time, and where they might have been, and if they targeted children. And while there were some that were active during this time, in number one, Constance Fisher, who was a paranoid schizophrenic who strangled 2 of her children, drowned the other one, another one of her children in the bathtub in her home in 1954. She would go on to be committed to a mental institution for 5 years and would later kill 3 more of her children in 1966. Now, Constance Fisher would be in the mental institution during Danny's disappearance, which effectively eliminates her entirely. However, her home was in Waterville, Maine, which was only an hour away, which, close proximity, but again, Constance Fisher, I could probably do a whole episode on her. Crazy, one of the craziest stories I think I've read, but again, there's no connection there, and she was in the mental institution. And number 2, the other serial killer that was active in Maine during the time period of Danny's disappearance and murder would be Charles Terry. Charles, who enlisted in the U.S. Army at age 17, would later be dishonorably discharged and sentenced to time in prison, in which he would be alleged to have been raped by other inmates during his time in prison. Once Charles Terry got out in 1951, he sexually assaulted 2 women in Kennebec County and was sentenced to 8 years in jail, putting him well in prison during the time of Danny's disappearance and effectively eliminating him as well. Now, Charles Terry's main target was women, and he was rumored to have murdered Shirley Coolin, in 1951, although it was never fully proven. Patricia Wing, later in 1958, again, this was another rumored killing of Charles Terry's, and Donna Kimmy in 1962 in Louisiana. Again, this was a theorized killing, as Charles Terry was in New Orleans during this time, and he is widely connected to that. And another case in Zenobia Clegg in 1963, who Charles Terry actually confessed to killing. Now, it is also rumored that Charles Terry might have had a hand in some of the unsolved Boston Strangler killings as well. However, not super important to Daniel Wood Jr.'s case, and because of his time spending in prison during the case of Danny's, we can eliminate both Charles Terry and Constance Fisher off of our list of suspects. Now, our last little bullet point and our last theory is an unnamed Alabama man. Now, this theory hinges on the idea of the tip given by the woman on the other end of the line that called Mrs. Wood that night. Is it true that perhaps someone from Birmingham, Alabama, who ran this boarding school kind of farm, could have been responsible, and that's who was in this car that Donna Aberle saw? The color of the sedan matched up, and to make it more compelling, and you might say, oh, the yellow license plate. Is Alabama's license plate yellow during 1954? During 1954, it wasn't. But if you go back just a few years to 1951, Alabama's license plates were yellow. Now, I haven't seen any other content creator mention this fact, and it just took me an extra second of digging to find this out. Now, if his car, the maroon Ford Studebaker sedan, got its license plate in 1951, it would stay yellow unless this guy changed it. Now, the only quote-unquote farm that I could find that resembled anything what this woman mentioned on the phone to Mrs. Wood would be the Alabama State Training School for Girls in Chalkville, Alabama, outside of Birmingham. Now, the campus of the Alabama State Training School for Girls is very farm-like, and it was a very strict reform school where the teachers were more like wardens that oversaw everything the girls did while spending their time there. Now, it could be possible that this individual, could also be from the neighboring Alabama Boys Industrial School, but the training school for girls looks more farm-like compared to the Boys Industrial School. Now, of course, these are the only two places that I think could match up to what is described by this woman who identified herself as Goodson or Gidson, whatever it was. These were the only places that I could find that could match up. And again, it might not be a farm at face value, but if you look up old pictures of this, if you Google the Alabama State Training School for Girls, and you look at the pictures of the campus, they are huge, spread out campuses. They have these huge fields. And on the surface, you could kind of describe it as a farm because of how these buildings are spread out all over the place and in these wide open fields. Now, of course, both schools are closed. And the history at the Alabama Training School for Girls is pretty dark. And the conditions there were pretty terrible. The only thing is that I couldn't find any information about who ran the place. So I'm at a dead end. Although I think this was a good lead that no one really followed up on. Now, our last theory is called 2003 letter, and let me explain what 2003 letter means. One last thing that I did not mention in the meat of the episode is that later on in 2003, a letter would be received throughout numerous residences within the town of Gray, even at the Wood household, and these letters were written by a man named Ronald Ridge. Ridge goes on in this letter to tell a story about a man who lived nearby that molested him as a child and thinks that he should be investigated for the murder of Daniel Wood Jr. Ridge said that this man lived on Route 100, not far from the Wood family home. Now, the full details and whether or not names were mentioned in this letter have not been released to the public by the Maine State Police, and it turns out this man mentioned in the letter from Ridge actually passed away in the years prior to him mailing out this letter. So, of course, this is another dead end, as he cannot be questioned, and us, the public, don't know who he is. Mrs. Wood and Daniel Wood Sr. would both pass away before the 2003 letters would be mailed out, so they themselves couldn't provide any context to the investigation on who this man might be. It's an interesting tidbit, but it doesn't really explain the maroon car or yellow license plate that Donna Aberle saw Danny in. It is weird, however, that 21 years later, we still don't know the name of the man mentioned in this letter from Ridge. But with that being said, let's get into my own personal thoughts. Now, I think I have to go the route of this perhaps being an unidentified man from Alabama. The Barmore thing doesn't really sell me because of the difference of the killings. And of course, he would not comment on a crime that he had involvement in or didn't have any involvement in. And again, why would he talk if he did or didn't do it? He was already in prison. And to me, the MOs are different, and I just frankly don't think it was him. There's just not enough information there to really sell me on that one. And again, Lucien Picard was a drunk, and I doubt his ability to get across state lines, commit the crime, and make it back to Canada without being caught. That, of course, leaves me with the unknown man from Alabama, and obviously the family that was in the car with him. And the phone call made to the Wood household by this Gidson woman. And if the car was registered in 1951, the Alabama license plate would be yellow, and the maroon Ford Studebaker car would also fit. These would be two things that are connected to the case. I am not sure the motivation, perhaps this man or the family that Danny was seen in the maroon sedan with, what their motives would be for killing Danny, but I think that this is the best lead we have. Because of the lack of DNA evidence as that technology wasn't in use, and the fact that the police kind of put this phone call down completely as a hoax, makes me think that either a family member of the killer coming forward would be the only way we find anything else about this case, or even kind of figure out who committed it. Cases like this, and ones that grip these small rural communities, seem to always be very difficult to solve because of the possibilities that this could be either a valued community member or someone nobody has ever even heard of. Or the fact that this could have been kind of all at the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, of course, I do hope that we do have answers about this case, and this has been one of the more open-ended and mysterious cases I have done up to this point in doing Unblurring the Unknown. And that is mostly because we don't really have anything to go off of. Again, it's almost like one day Danny Wood Jr. is here, and the next day he is not. But that being said, of course, that is my personal thoughts. I think that this unidentified Alabama man should be a lead that is followed up with. I don't know if he is surefire the killer, but it is at least an avenue that the police should have explored. But I think it is too late to explore it now because we just don't know. I hope, obviously, the case of Danny Wood Jr. gets solved. But again, like I said, we don't have anything to go off of. And I think at this point, it would only take a distant relative saying that their relative did this and confessed to them, and they just have not come forward. Unfortunately, again, very sad story, remains unknown 70 years past the point of when Danny Wood Jr. would be discovered in that river. And again, very sad case. No real happy ending to it, but of course, that is the mystery. That is the unsolvedness of it, and that is what I cover, obviously, here on Unblurring the Unknown. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown. And yeah, very, very sad one. I do apologize. Again, I like to keep it as laid back and as fun as I possibly can. But this is a sad one. And to all those you that I've kind of teased about the Springfield 3 episode, I will be doing them, so do not worry. Don't get all worked up. I will eventually do it. I promise, I promise, I promise. But with that being said, that's going to conclude this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed going back into New England with me to do a New England-based episode. I hope you all enjoyed this one and enjoyed this relatively unknown, unsolved murder. But that's going to do it for me, and I will see you all on the next episode.